Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the impact which Reform UK may have on the general election. Because as we get closer, polling's showing an increasingly strengthened Reform UK vote share. There's no end of analysis showing how many seats the Tories are likely to lose as a result of the right-wing vote being split so badly. Tory MPs are howling for Sunak to come up with some arrangement with Richard Tice, or at least get Nigel Farage on board with them. There are also some who think that the Tories will be highly motivated to come to a deal with Reform UK and persuade them to stand candidates down. I think a variation of this idea is certainly possible. I don't know how likely. But one thing that few are talking about is the third possibility, that Reform UK struggle to actually stand candidates in every seat in Britain. Not because they do a deal with the Tories, but because they can't physically manage it. It's worth considering the Reform UK have already had to bin nearly 70 candidates because their selection and vetting processes are basically non-existent. So essentially their vetting processes, you have to sign a form that says you're not crazy. Some time ago I said of the prospect of Reform UK standing candidates in every seat in Britain, I thought, well, that's a bit questionable. The Lib Dems and the Green Party, they don't stand candidates everywhere. And they've got a proper party infrastructure with local party bureaucracy and activists. But selecting candidates who won't embarrass you in the election campaign is a tricky business. By its very nature, politics attracts those who want power, and not everyone who wants power wants to wield it in the interests of others. So you need to vet candidates carefully. And even doing that doesn't guarantee the best candidates, as both Labour and the Greens discovered in Rochdale recently. You know, when I look at Reform UK, I imagine that scene from The Simpsons where Burns and Smithers are running the nuclear power plant on their own. You know, they're running it as a business with only a small number of decision makers. They have their supporters, but no infrastructure in place to really support them. They're really more like a special interest campaign group rather than a political party. And sure enough, we have been seeing a steady stream of Reform UK candidates being dropped by the party due to their abhorrent views becoming public, usually of a racist nature. Much of this has been spearheaded by Hope Not Hate. And Tice has been making a virtue of acting so quickly to sack the candidates. Of course, it's easy to act quickly when there's no due process in your organisation. But even if Tice is sacking candidates when their past become known, it begs the question, why didn't their supposedly stringent vetting procedure turn these things up? Because quite a lot of the evidence wasn't like secret. It was on Twitter or Facebook. It was all there to be seen. And there's also another question in the back of my mind. So when a group such as Hope Not Hate finds unworthy behaviour in candidates of whatever party, but, you know, a lot of it's the Reform UK party, they draw attention to it. And Tice agrees, oh, yeah, this isn't a good look for our party. So he drops the candidates. Fine. But who do Reform UK most threaten in the political world? It's the Conservative Party, isn't it? And the Conservative Party are on a mission to dig up as much dirt as they can on their rivals. Or they will be scrutinising Labour candidates very carefully. That's a given. But surely they'll also be trying to find as much as they can on Reform UK candidates as well. And if they find anything, what are they going to do with this information? Make it public? No way. At least not now. That would be a waste. They'll sit on it in the hope that nobody else discovers it. They'll wait for the election to be called, for the deadline for candidates to pass, and then they'll announce it. What does Tice do then? Does he remain on his moral high horse by immediately disowning the candidates, but then having no candidate in that seat? Would it even make much difference? Like when a real political party sacks their candidate, I mean, we saw what happened in Rochdale. They pull all resources, they tell activists not to campaign for them. Doesn't really exist for Reform UK because, I mean, if local supporters want to campaign for that candidate anyway, they'll do so. There's no real being kicked out of the party because, well, there's no members of the party. There's like 3. The party actually has 3 members. You know, so not even their own candidates are members of the party, with the exception of Richard Tice, who will be standing. I did suggest that if Reform UK want to simply give a steer to the Conservative Party, you know, wouldn't it have been better for them to agree to step down candidates not against existing Tory seats, as they did in 2019, but in favour of Conservative candidates attuned to their way of thinking? In other words, they don't stand against the crazies in the Tory party, just those with some basic grounding in reality. Then, as with other smaller parties, they could pragmatically focus on fewer seats, but make sure that they could spend the time getting candidates who at least know how to play the political game. Because I really don't know what Tice expected. That their candidates would turn out to be bigoted individuals with a very shaky grasp of reality was not only predictable, but predicted. It was obvious. We've seen it before with the Brexit Party and UKIP. So what does it mean for the election? Well, Reform UK's campaigning is almost all top-down. It's just like their economic theories, really. That is to say, almost everything that the public know about the party comes from mainstream media. There's relatively little campaigning at the local level compared to other parties because of the aforementioned lack of a party structure across the country. It may be that if Tice continues to drop candidates who are outed, even after the deadline, maybe it won't even affect them that much. Like if most of the campaigning is national, Vote Reform UK, it's all in the papers and all their main campaignings in the television and the newspapers and so on the internet rather than local. And the ballot paper still has Reform UK on it because once the deadline's passed, it's fixed, even though the parties quietly drop them. Then his main goal may still be achieved. People may still vote for that candidate, either not knowing or not caring that they're no longer the official Reform UK candidate. After all, those candidates will still be campaigning for basically the same policies. They'll still be hiving votes away from the Conservatives. I mean, I'll tell you what I find vaguely ironic about this entire thing. So, Reform UK have been hiving off potentially millions of Conservative votes from the xenophobic wing of the party. Because, I mean, let's be clear. The Reform UK may say they've got a whole range of policies, but, the policies they're plugging are ultimately... I mean, it's not even that it's just anti-immigration policies. It's also anti-cooperation with any country that's not Britain policies as well. They don't even call, the country the UK. They have Reform UK, but they always talk about Britain, right? It's just Britain, Britain, Britain. So it's ultimately an anti-foreigner platform. So voters aligned with these views are leaving the Conservative Party in very significant numbers to Reform UK. Now, here's the irony. As the Conservative Party loses more of these anti-foreigner votes, they become themselves increasingly anti-foreigner in a failing bid to win them back. I mean, I think I need to talk about the reports of crazier stuff to come from the Tories tomorrow or the next day. There's so much coming out this weekend. But what we've seen is the Tories shifting further and further to the far right, even as the proportion of far right voters backing them has gone down. It's the more they chase after those Reform UK votes, the more they lose. And the reason for that is because they're just making a bigger issue of it. It's a bizarre twist that the Tories could just choose to accept that they're not going to win back the crazy vote against a much crazier party and could instead focus on more crowd-pleasing policies for swing voters willing to consider their options. But they're doing the opposite. And by moving further to the right, the Tories, they're not going to win back those Reform UK votes. Because if Reform UK are on the ballot, their ideas will always sound better to these people. And the track record of Tory failure will also be in Reform UK's favour. But the Conservatives do risk more moderate voters opting for someone else or just not voting at all. In 1997, voter turnout was lower than in 1992. Why? Conservative voters stayed home. Labour won an extra 2 million votes in 97 compared to 92, but the Conservatives lost 4.5 million. Now, of course, there's population changes in that time, but what was happened there is some of those people that had voted Conservative in 92 were voting for someone else, most notably Labour. But most didn't. Most didn't vote for someone else. They just disappeared altogether. They didn't vote. They didn't want to vote for Labour. They're used to voting for the Conservatives. But they couldn't bring themselves to vote for the failure in public services and Tory sleaze in 97. So they just stayed at home. They didn't vote for anyone. There's a good chance the same thing happens this year as well. In fact, if anything, the country's in a much worse mess. At the time, no one had any major gripes about the economy, for example. It was all the state of public services and Tory sleaze. Now, it's everything. If Reform UK struggle to stand the candidates they say they will. The Tories will benefit, absolutely, but it's not the case that those Reform UK voters will just flip back to the Tories. If there's no Reform option on the ballot, it doesn't mean they go to the Tories. Some will, but most will either pick someone else because they don't want to vote for the Conservatives, or they will stay home. And that's what polling is indicating now. It's what we saw in the 90s. It's what polling is suggesting now. That actually most people who say they'll vote Reform UK, they don't like Labour, but they also don't like the Conservatives. And there are some people, they don't just pick what they think is the best option or the least worst option, depending on how you look at it. There are millions who will not vote at all if they don't like any of the options. And the Tories don't seem to be aware of that. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.